his underwear to go parachuting. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA champion Tyrus. He took 2 buses to work today, one under each arm. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA champion Tyrus. Grandmas want him for Valentine's Day. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. You gotta stand up. The National Weather Service names his sneezes. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. And he's enormous and here to inform us. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. He once used Tom Shalhoub as a Q-tip. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. And finally, he's like a chairlift. Old ladies love to go up and down on him. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. He can crush a beer keg on his forehead. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world He can rip a phone company in half. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. And old ladies fall hard for this former bodyguard. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. And like water aerobics, old ladies love doing him in the pool. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. And just like knitting, old ladies love doing him in a rocking chair. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. And no one can stop us with the help of this colossus. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion. He's the reason for drawbridges. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. And he's the reason for cathedral ceilings. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. And despite their loss of bone density, old women love him with intensity. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. He has a walk-in belly button. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, former NWA world champion Tyrus. He may be gigantic, but he makes old ladies frantic. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion. And like a city bus, old women love to hop on and off him. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, former NWA world champion Tyrus. And like their teeth, old ladies like to take him out at night. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, former NWA world champion Tyrus. Like a dish of butterscotch candy, old ladies prefer him hard. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. Strong as an ox and thinks outside the box. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. And he goes to the big and tall section at the big and tall store. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. His pecs include a bike lane. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA champion Tyrus. He makes The Rock look like a pebble. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. For him, every van is a minivan. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. And he's like a nap. Old ladies like to take him in the afternoon. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. And like a sofa covered in plastic, old ladies love to sit on him. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. And he needs a pit crew to apply deodorant. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion Tyrus. Just like Mount Everest, there's a 3-year wait just to climb him. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And he causes more old ladies to faint than open casket funerals. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And he used a whole book of stamps sending out Mother's Day cards. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. He's big in Japan and everywhere else. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And like a tea kettle, when he whistles, old ladies come. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, former NBA World Champion Tyrus. The Statue of Liberty looks up to him. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And when old women see him, they shout, AAR, please. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, former NWA World Champion Tyrus. Bigfoot reports sightings of him. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. He likes his women the way he likes the weather, over 80. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and NWA World Champion Tyrus. And finally, old ladies consider his arms weapons of mass seduction. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And he's the reason CVS ran out of Father's Day cards. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And that's not a 5-person sleeping bag, it's one of his gloves. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And old ladies call him the denture whisperer. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And he likes to whisper sweet nothings into his fans' hearing aids. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. He's got enormous arms and old broads love his charms. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA Tyrus. And his many fans ask him to sign their support hose. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. Old ladies pass him around like a tube of Polygrip. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And he spent Father's Day alphabetizing his cards. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And he's dropped more pounds than Prince Andrew at a strip club. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And they had to use the Space Needle for his tetanus shot. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And yes, ladies, he'll definitely autograph your bingo card. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. If he gets any slimmer, I'm going to start calling him Black Cat. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. He once gave the heads on Mount Rushmore noogies. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And he makes his fans' pacemakers skip a beat. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. He can lift your spirits and a car off your chest. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. He can curl 300-pound dumbbells. But enough about the View. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA World Champion Tyrus. And that wasn't a tsunami. He just did a cannonball. New York Times bestselling author.
And horses measure their strength in Tyrus power. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, former NWA World Champion Tyrus.
And he has to rent a bus for Take Your Kids to Work Day, New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion. It's Tyrus.
And he's on every old lady's bucket list. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus.
He's like a shawl, because old ladies want to wrap him around their bodies. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, former NWA world champion, Tyrus.
And his idea of a protein shake is throwing a cow into a wood chipper. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. He's newly svelte and makes old ladies melt. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. And like a game of pickleball, old ladies do him in pairs. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. And women praise his abilities at assisted living facilities. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. He's lost so much weight, his scale has reported him missing. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. And he's the only man on earth strong enough to carry all of Kill Me's hate mail. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. And at the local drive-in, they project the movie onto his t-shirt. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. Labor Day is another reminder of all the women he put into labor. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus.
And he uses manhole covers as coasters. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, former NWA world champion.
And sharks yell Tyrus when he gets in the water. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus.
Every morning he has to check his shoes for old ladies. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and he has to take out a second mortgage to pay for back-to-school supplies. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion. And he refers to the Great Lakes as just the lakes. New York Times best-selling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. The only time he's PC is when he's punishing chumps. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. And they continue to find missing hikers on his back. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. And he doesn't know the meaning of the words stepladder. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. His groupies backstage are of an advanced age. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, former NWA world champion, Tyrus. And no one's ever offered him the top bunk. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, former NWA world champion, Tyrus. And finally, his roller skates have 18 wheels. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. That wasn't an eclipse on Sunday. He just stood up to stretch. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. He rarely smiles because flocks of geese get stuck in his teeth. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. And his tailor needs a scaffold to measure his inseam. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. Barber has to use a jetpack. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. He picks his teeth with the Washington Monument. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. And he invented time travel by knocking people into next week. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. When he walks into a building, the building says, ouch. New York Times bestselling author, comedian, and former NWA world champion, Tyrus. He makes his female fans feel like they're 80 again. Former NWA world champion, Planet Tyrus. He'll make you laugh while exposing his calf. Former NWA World Champion and host of Planet Tyrus podcast. And he loves to go on adventures and collect old lady dentures. Former WWE Champion. He's tall enough to raise the roof, and a lot of his fans have shingles. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. And his fans send him nudes via Pony Express. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. He makes his female fans flip, giving them a broken hip. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. And he makes old ladies scream, "Get on my lawn." Former NWA champion of the Planet Tyrus podcast. He gives Halloween candy to every kid in case they're his. Former NWA world champion and host of Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. And he's put more old ladies to bed than relax him. Former NWA world champion, host of Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. And old ladies ask him for help walking across the street to their bedroom. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. And to him, big and tall shops are just shops. Wow. Former NWA World Champion and host of Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. And if you hear your grandmother moaning, it's because she's reading his new book. Former NWA World Champion host of Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. And his female fans are like a hot summer day, really bright and well into their 80s. Former NWA World Champion host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. And his handshake comes with a medical waiver. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. And on Thanksgiving, old ladies request that he bring the dark meat. Former NWA World Champion of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. On Thanksgiving, old ladies want him to do the stuffing. Former NWA World Champion and host of Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus.
He's really big, and old ladies want to do sex with him. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus.
And old ladies pine for his Yule log. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. Old ladies would rather sit on his lap for Christmas. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. He trims his beard with a prison road gang. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. Finally, old women put him on their naughty list. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. And like water aerobics, old ladies love to do him in groups. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. This time of year, his fans can't wait for him to slide down their chimneys. Former NWA World Champion and host of Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus.
And people constantly mistake his shadow for an eclipse. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus.
And women wish he snuck into their house with his giant sack. Former NWA World Champion and host of Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus.
I don't know.
And for him to stand under mistletoe, you gotta hang it on the moon. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus.
I just clap for myself.
And old women sit on his lap and tell him what they want all year long. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. And old ladies everywhere want to unwrap his candy cane. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus. And he pulls Santa's sleigh when Rudolph calls in sick. Former NWA World Champion, host of Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus.
And his loudest applause comes from women post-menopause. Former NWA World Champion and host of the Planet Tyrus podcast, Tyrus.